Hello, this is The Globalist, broadcasting to you live from Midori House in London. I'm Georgina Godwin. On the show ahead, on New Year's Day, Ukraine stopped the passage of Russian gas through the country. We'll examine the financial and geopolitical ramifications. Then,
people are arriving currently from 6 border points, and that requires scaling up of all resources.
But scaling up of all resources is not happening in Sudan. We'll analyse the multiple factors exacerbating the hunger crisis there. We'll hear the latest climate news and also have a look at the front pages, including how an attack in New Orleans on January the 1st has been covered around the world. Plus,
there is a chance that Ukraine will be in stronger position. There is a chance that Europe would find its strength.
Lithuania's former foreign minister offers us his outlook for 2025. That's all ahead here on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in the news. A Tesla Cybertruck exploded in flames outside the Trump International Hotel in Las Vegas on Wednesday, killing the driver and injuring 7 others. South Korea's impeached President Yoon Suk-yeol has sent a letter rallying his supporters, saying he would fight until the end as he faces an attempt by authorities to arrest him over his short-lived December the 3rd martial law. And Romania and Bulgaria scrapped land border controls to become full members of the European Union's Schengen free travel area yesterday, joining an expanded bloc of countries whose residents can now travel without passenger and passport checks. And do stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on those stories. Now, my first guest in the studio is Charles Hecker, a political risk analyst and author of Zero Sum, the Arc of International Business in Russia. Happy New Year to you, Charles.
Good morning, Georgina. Happy New Year.
And I know that it was a good one because we spent a little part of the intervening time together.
That's right. And our New Year's Eve was my celebration to welcome 2025.
Well, it was a lovely, lovely celebration. I'm so glad that you're here for our top story today because despite Russia's war on Ukraine, Russian gas has continued to flow to Europe through a pipeline in Ukraine, but it did come to an end yesterday on the 1st of January. So, Charles, for many it's surprising that gas flows continued during the conflict. Can you tell us about the transit contract, who it serviced and why it's ended?
That's right. This is a 5-year contract that saw Russian gas transit through Ukraine to customers in Eastern Europe and beyond. And it was between 2 companies. It wasn't between the countries. It was between Naftogaz of Ukraine and Gazprom of Russia. And you're right to point out that even after the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014, the contract was renewed. And I suspect that was as a result of pressure from Eastern Europe and from the European Union, which was the biggest customer. Russia at the time was responsible for around 40% of all European gas imports. Once the full-scale invasion of Ukraine broke out, that number has dropped to 10%. With the end of this contract, which Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said he would not renew on January 1st, yesterday, that is a drop of yet another 5% of European gas supplies. Most proximally, this will affect markets in Austria, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and a tiny bit in Hungary. They are all going to have to find gas from alternative sources. And Russia will lose about $6 billion in annual revenue as a result of the blockade of the Ukrainian pipeline.
And what will it mean for Ukraine's GDP?
Well, that's right. So Ukraine was earning about $1 billion a year in transit fees alone. And the impact on Ukraine will be serious. There are reports that domestic customers in Ukraine are paying more for the transit of gas domestically to help fill that gap. This is at a time when Ukraine can ill afford any sort of increases in energy prices, but there is a fairly large hole in the income of Naftogaz as a result of the closing of this transit route.
And I mean, is it worth it for Ukraine? I mean, is this a form of non-military combat? This is a war effort.
That's exactly right. So it is. On balance, Zelensky took the decision that providing Russia with the opportunity to rake in these billions of dollars of annual revenue that went to fund the war was something that he could no longer envisage and no longer countenance. And this is one of the economic pieces of leverage that Zelensky had. And we sort of knew in advance, and markets knew and countries knew and customers knew in advance that it was highly likely that he would not renew this contract and he would shut down transit for Russian gas. And this is one of the most severe blows that he can really strike on Russia, given that militarily things are not going very well for Ukraine on the ground.
Now, you mentioned some of the countries that receive Russian gas, but worse off than most other recipients is Moldova. Why is that?
That's right. Moldova right now is the victim of a periodic episode of extortion from Gazprom and Russia, saying that they are going to cut off supplies to Moldova as a result of unpaid bills. The amount that Moldova allegedly owes Gazprom is under significant dispute. There's a huge delta between what Moldova says it owes and what Russia says it's owed. What's interesting about this is that the point of conflict in this game between Russia and Moldova is Transnistria. Transnistria is a breakaway region of Moldova that is supported by Russia. And it looks like Russia is cutting Transnistria loose. In fact, the energy company locally in this breakaway region has told its customers to dress up warm, to sit in one room of their apartment and only heat that one room, and to really sort of buckle down and get ready for a very difficult immediate future as gas supplies and the power generating stations that they fire have to go into sort of emergency mode.
What about the effect on the rest of Europe? I mean, as you say, we know that the European Commission introduced a non-binding goal of stopping all gas imports by 2027. We know that, as you say, it's gone down to 10%. But how much of an effect will this have on Europe, which had already started the decoupling process?
Right. At the moment, for now, European gas storage levels are high. And barring a catastrophically cold winter, Europe should be able to make it through the next few months without any dramatic disruptions to supply or to the cost of energy. That said, energy markets in Europe, whether it's oil or gas, are tight, and markets don't like disruption. That causes price volatility. And so going forward, Europe is going to have to look to other suppliers. Of course, pressure will ease in spring and summer, but Europe is looking to Azerbaijan, it's looking to Algeria, it's looking to the United States, it's looking to Norway. There are alternate sources of supply, but the market's tight and there may be some cost disruption coming up.
Charles, thank you very much indeed. That's Charles Hecker there, and this is The Globalist. "9:09 in Khartoum, 7:09 here in London. And we go now to Sudan, where the already catastrophic humanitarian conditions are predicted to escalate as famine spreads across the land. There are many different forces exacerbating the situation, and here to unpick what's going on is Yasmin Abdel-Majid, the Sudanese-Australian writer and broadcaster. Yasmin, lovely to have you back with us, and Happy New Year to you. The IPC stands for the Famine Review Committee of the Integrated Food Phase Classification. That's a 5-member review committee. It vets and verifies famine findings produced by technical analysts. Now, they've just released a new report on Tuesday. What does that say?
Thanks, Georgina. That's right. So the IPC only declares famine in very severe cases. And I'm going to dig into this just a little, just so we can understand how bad the situation is. A famine designation requires the meeting of 3 criteria: more than 20% of the population facing severe food shortages, 1 in 3 children suffering from acute malnutrition, and 2 people per 10,000 dying each day from hunger-related causes. Now, last year, the IPC declared famine at Zamzam camp, so one particular area in Darfur, but now it says that famine has spread and has declared it in 5 different areas in North Darfur and the Nuba Mountain regions, and says there's imminent famine in parts of South Darfur, and 17 other areas are under threat of famine. So we're seeing the IPC declaring, and I should also say that in the 20 years the IPC has been working, they've only declared famine 4 other times. So this is incredible. This is an incredibly severe classification. However, the other thing to note is the Sudanese government pulled out from the IPC the night on the eve of this declaration, on the eve of this report, declaring or essentially arguing that this was a move against the sovereignty of Sudan, which is also going to make it more difficult in the future for the IPC to do its work. The last thing that is quite important in this report is they said that between December 24 and May 25, so the 6-month period we're in now, it projects 24.6 million people, approximately half the population, will face acute food insecurity. And go ahead. Sorry.
I just wonder how much of the famine situation is driven by conflict.
Well, that was exactly what I was going to move to, Georgina, because you are right in that almost it is entirely man-made. And this is the true devastating part, because Sudan is a country that can almost feed itself when you look at what it can produce, what it can harvest, and so on. But ultimately, both sides, if we can use that framing for the moment, the Sudanese government and the Rapid Support Forces, the militia, have been using famine or been using food insecurity as a weapon of war. The Sudanese government has not really allowed much aid to get into the country. Only in August 2024 was one of the major access entries into Darfur Adre opened to allow some food to come in. But only in the last week of December 2024 was the first food aid convoy allowed into Khartoum. So after almost 2 years of conflict, the first food aid got to Khartoum, and that was not negotiated by UN agencies and so on. That was negotiated between the World Food Programme and local NGOs and the emergency response rooms. And this is another thing where, when we're looking at the international pressure, unfortunately, the United Nations has been wary to put too much pressure on Sudanese government to allow aid into the country, because they don't want to be expelled. Sudan has a history of expelling international organizations and deciding not to engage whatsoever. And so you've got this delicate balance between NGOs and UN agencies trying to get food in, and the government the Sudanese government and the Rapid Support Forces not being interested at all in letting anything in. Even the militia themselves have also raided convoys coming in, warehouses containing aid and so on. That has been part of their destruction as well.
Why, Yasmin?
Oh, I mean, this is the question, isn't it? Ultimately, when we're looking at how this conflict is playing out, and we're reaching the end of the 2nd year now. So we're looking at moving into the 3rd year of the conflict. It began as a counter-revolutionary war against the civilian movement, and now it has deepened and worsened. And unfortunately, there is neither side, whether it's the traditional Sudanese government or the militia, have any real reason at the moment, militarily or politically, to stop fighting. And this is simply just another weapon that it can use against the Sudanese people, but also kind of against each other. Both sides believe at the moment that they can win militarily. It is unlikely. Sudan has almost never in Sudanese history does any war end militarily. There's always a political solution. And this is another key thing when we're thinking about what the international community can do. There is the talk often that, there needs to be a ceasefire, and then we can do the humanitarian work, and then we can get to the political solution. But unfortunately, we cannot do these things one after the other. They have to all be done simultaneously. And so, because unfortunately there seems to be very little regard for human life by both the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces, ultimately it appears that they can do what they like and also curry favor with the Sudanese people, because we're in a situation now where the case for the Sudan state. I mean, the Rapid Support Forces is trying to start up its own parallel government at the moment. They're trying to also bring the rest of the Sudanese people onto either side and saying, well, if you side with us, perhaps, you'll be able to access food.
So, I mean, is there any way then of averting escalation?
There always has to be a way. And I do believe that it is possible. When we're looking at the sort of the political, one interesting development in the last few months has been Turkey putting its hand up and saying it would be interested in helping negotiate some sort of a solution, whether or not Turkey has the ability to pull the UAE in line, which is a key backer of the Rapid Support Forces, and nothing can really change without the UAE sitting at the table, will be interesting. At the sort of humanitarian level, can we get food to people on the ground, making sure that we are, international organizations are negotiating with the emergency response rooms, with the groups on the ground, which hasn't happened as much as it should. There's this broad sense that a broad understanding that the aid on the ground is best delivered through the local organizers, but larger international organizations have been reticent to engage with sort of grassroots organizations because they're not just, it's not the traditional way of doing aid, but it is the only successful way to get food to people. It's been demonstrated that it is the most successful way to get food to people on the ground. So international pressure to get food through the grassroots groups that are already doing that, already feeding their communities. And also, like we're doing today, continuing to talk about Sudan. Sudan, unfortunately, even though it's the worst humanitarian crisis in the world right now, languishes in the headlines. It is not something we talk often about, but it is vital that we keep talking about it in order to ensure no further escalation occurs.
Yasmin, thank you very much indeed. That's Yasmin Abdel-Majid there. Now, still to come on the programme.
First of all, we do know that the city of New Orleans was impacted by a terrorist attack. It's all still under investigation.
This is The Globalist. Well, let's continue now with today's newspapers. And joining me is Paul Waldy, who's Europe correspondent at The Globe and Mail. Good morning and Happy New Year to you, Paul.
Hi there. Happy New Year.
Not a Happy New Year at all in New Orleans. This awful attack, 15 people dead that we know of. Can you tell us how this has been covered and what more has come to light?
Well, it's certainly getting an awful lot of coverage because, of course, it's still an unfolding story. Now we have police saying that 15 people have died, at least 30 or more have been injured in this attack. So I think there's still a lot of questions about who the perpetrator was, whether he had other accomplices. The police are saying this wasn't someone acting alone, and whether there's connections to another explosion in Las Vegas. So I think there's still an awful lot of news that's going to come out of this over the next few days.
Well, let's talk about that connection to the explosion of the truck in Las Vegas. I mean, is it also the two names linked to that? Obviously, Elon Musk, who owns the company that made the truck, and Donald Trump, who owns the hotel. Obviously, we know they're politically linked. Is there something in this?
Well, that's what I think police are trying to understand. The incident in New Orleans happened at about 3 a.m. On New Year's Day, sort of as, revelers were kind of in the last throes of celebrating in New Orleans. This truck rammed down a street, Bourbon Street, very popular area in New Orleans. And then a few hours later in Las Vegas, outside a Trump hotel, a Tesla truck, a cyber truck, blew up. And there's suggestions that it was loaded with explosives and other things. Now, the driver was the only person killed. 7 other people were injured, but there's still an awful lot of questions about whether these two incidences were linked. Now, both of these vehicles were rented through an app called Turo, which is sort of it's kind of like the equivalent of Airbnb for car rentals. If you own a car, you can put it on here and people can rent it. So there is some suggestion that maybe that's a connection, but beyond that, police haven't established any links, but there's still an awful lot of uncertainty around. Police are saying in New Orleans that this was not someone who acted alone, and then police are still trying to understand what happened in Las Vegas. There's certainly going to be a lot of interest in whether or not there is a connection.
Let's go to Canada now, and calls for Justin Trudeau to resign are piling up.
Yeah, they sure are. I mean, this has not been a great Christmas for Justin Trudeau. He has been under an awful lot of pressure to resign or call an election or do both ever since he kind of fired the finance minister, Chrystia Freeland, just before Christmas. So there's been huge pressure building on him from within the party now. The MPs in the Liberal Party tend to be pretty placid, but now they're kind of coming out in force and saying he's got to resign. It's a complicated situation because he has a minority government. If he resigns, that could trigger an election. The party would go into without a leader. So there's an awful lot of questions about how he would resign and have a new leader in place. But either way, the latest polling is showing that the Liberals are at least 26 points behind the Conservative Party, certainly with Trudeau at the helm. It's not clear they do much better with a new leader. So either way, it looks like Canada's facing an election pretty soon and the likely prospect of a new prime minister.
And a timeline on that? Any idea?
Well, that's the real question, because right now, because Trudeau has a minority government, the other parties have said they want to call an election as soon as they can or trigger an election as soon as they can. He would have to prorogue Parliament, effectively put it on pause, while the Liberal Party spent months trying to find a new leader. But then as soon as that leader entered Parliament, it's likely the opposition parties would trigger an election. So either way, there's probably going to be an election in the next few months. Now, Parliament is set to resume at the end of January under its normal schedule. So if Trudeau hasn't resigned and he comes back to Parliament at the end of January, the opposition parties have promised to trigger an election then. So I think probably by February or March, Canada is going to make some kind of decision about who's going to be prime minister.
Now, as you point out, Trudeau probably wasn't particularly celebrating this new year, but around the rest of the world, people were. And of course, one of the ways they do that is by drinking. I say we do that is by drinking a great deal of alcohol. But the FT has a very interesting piece about social pressure and alcohol-free drinks.
Yeah, it's interesting because alcohol and low alcohol drinks have actually been doing pretty well market-wise in the last few years. Alcohol sales have kind of flattened or even fallen off in some places, but sales of non-alcohol beer or low alcohol beer have gone up by at least 4% in many places. But what this survey shows is that there's an awful lot of social pressure to not drink or to keep drinking alcohol drinks. This is a survey of almost 12,000 people in the UK, US, Spain, and Japan, and Brazil. And it found that while almost 80% of people said they tried non-alcoholic drinks over the past year, a good proportion of them, 38% of men under the age of 27, said that they felt real pressure from friends if they were drinking a non-alcohol drink and everybody else was drinking an alcoholic drink. So they felt pressure to not drink it, and they would only drink a non-alcohol drink if their friends were doing it. So it shows some reluctance, at least in social situations, for people to make the switch to a non-alcohol drink or have the confidence to do that. And that could affect sales going forward, or it could affect the sort of trends we've seen in the last little while of sales increasing on the non-alcohol side. If people feel in a social setting they're still not quite comfortable drinking non-alcohol when everybody else is drinking an alcoholic drink.
But I wonder how much of that's to do with taste. I think a non-alcoholic wine is absolutely vile. I haven't found one I can drink yet.
That's the other challenge, of course, they face, is that while these folks have tried a non-alcohol drink over once or twice over the past year, it's not certain that they're going to stick with it. And again, taste is an issue, price is an issue, but now we're finding that social pressure is an issue. So all of those things are working against the industry, even as it shows signs that this is an area that most beer makers anyway want to get into.
Paul, thank you very much indeed. That's Paul Waldy there. Now, here's what else we're keeping an eye on today. A Tesla Cybertruck exploded in flames outside the Trump International Hotel in Las Vegas on Wednesday, killing the driver and injuring 7 others. The FBI is investigating whether the blast was an act of terrorism and if it may be connected to the incident occurring just hours before, when a man drove a truck into crowds of New Year's Day revelers in New Orleans, killing 15. South Korea's impeached President Yoon Suk-yeol has sent a letter rallying his supporters, saying he'd fight until the end as he faces an attempt by authorities to arrest him over his short-lived December the 3rd martial law. On Tuesday, a court approved a warrant for Yoon's arrest, which potentially would make him the first sitting president to be detained as part of investigations over allegations he masterminded insurrection by trying to impose martial law. And Romania and Bulgaria scrapped land border controls to become full members of the European Union's Schengen-free travel area on Wednesday, joining an expanded bloc of countries whose residents can now travel without passport checks. Checks on travelling by air and sea from Bulgaria and Romania were lifted in March 2024, but land checks continued until last month, when Austria dropped a veto it had maintained on the grounds that more was needed to stop irregular migration. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Now it's time for the latest climate roundup. I'm joined by Monocle's contributing editor, Sheena Rossiter. Sheena, Happy New Year to you. Did you celebrate?
Yes, Happy New Year to you as well. Of course, I did celebrate, but with a little one at home, it's not too much of a rager going on around here. Just a few celebrations just at the New Year, really.
So what do you think, then, the big climate issues are going to be in this new year? What will be making headlines in 2025?
Well, dealing with plastics is definitely going to remain an important issue. In fact, the UN convened in talks earlier this year to kind of get to grips with the global epidemic of plastic pollution as they are looking to edge closer to some negotiations. They had some meetings in late 2024 in Busan, South Korea in November. That was the fifth round of negotiations, in fact, since the 2022 UN Environmental Assembly resolution called on a legally binding instrument on plastic pollution to including the marine environment. And they're really looking at trying to iron out plastic products, including chemicals, and making more sustainable production and composition and financing around that. Mm-hmm. And speaking of financing is remaining a big thorny issue in the international climate negotiations. We really saw this play out in COP29 in Baku when they were negotiating well beyond the conference there and basically looking for developing nations to try to get more financial contributions from the richer first world and developed countries. So they had this agreement put into place where they're looking to give $300 billion per year by 2035. And the deal is definitely a step forward, but it certainly falls short of the sum that they wanted to get, which was $1.3 trillion. And that's what climate experts say is needed in order to help adopt this progress. But of course, this is progress, that there is a finance deal put in place. So in 2025, that will be big talks going on as that moves forward. And there's going to be a summit in Spain at the end of June where this will certainly be big talks that will continue for the next 10 years.
And I understand that another big change will be that climate change is now on trial at the International Criminal Court. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it's on the docket. So on December 13th, the International Union of Conservation of Nature made history as it addressed the International Climate Court of Justice with a groundbreaking process to determine the legal obligations for countries in respect to climate change and the consequences of failing to act against taking measures for climate change. So these proceedings were a first at the International Criminal Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice. So the United Nations highest judicial authority has taken up this issue of climate change, potentially reshaping the global climate governance and strength that could look to go for legal actions going forward. So a total of 98 states and 12 international organizations did express interest to speak at the court. In the end, it only ended up being 96 countries and 11 regional organizations that took place in the hearing. And Vanuatu, the island nation in the Pacific Islands, was among them. And of course, that nation is in particular really vulnerable to the climate crisis, and it asked to be on an advisory position in the court in order to justify and clarify obligations by countries such as the United States in regarding climate change in order to inform future judicial proceedings. So it will deliberate for several months. It was just the initial hearing that happened in December, and then an advisory opinion on the subject will come through. It's also important to mention that although the opinion will be non-binding, it is expected to guide future international criminal law through how this goes with climate change being on the docket now.
Right. Now, of course, we know Donald Trump is about to occupy the White House again. What moves that he's claimed he will do are climate motivated?
This has been really interesting. So bold moves have been mentioned by the president-elect. So he claims that the United States will take back control of the Panama Canal from Panama and the nation of Greenland from Denmark. As he tried to take control of these parts of the world from sovereign nations, gaining control of places like the Panama Canal and Greenland, he said that it's in the U.S. national interest for security purposes. But, of course, it's speculated that both Panama and Greenland are significantly impacted by climate change. And this will actually kind of impact shipping routes in the future. And according to the New York Times, because of warming temperatures, it's estimated that 11,000 square miles of Greenland's ice sheets and glaciers have melted over the past 3 decades. And that's roughly equivalent to the size of the state of Massachusetts. And this is having a huge impact on the world. So with more melting ice around Greenland, that's expected to have rising sea levels as much as 23 feet, according to NASA. And Greenland could retreat to drilling for oil in certain places as well, and mining. And the fact is that that's already attracted international interest, and this is raising concerns about environmental harms in that area.
Sheena, thank you very much indeed. That's Sheena Rossiter in Edmonton. And this is Monocle Radio.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
And finally on today's show, 2024 was a big year for democracy. Nearly half the Earth's population in more than 70 countries were called upon to vote. And in many of those jurisdictions, it was the incumbents who were out. In Lithuania, it was its conservative party, the TSLKD, who lost to the centre-left Social Democratic Party. In response, the country's foreign minister, Gabrielius Landsbergis, resigned in both this capacity and as the chairman of his party. In his final week in the job, Andrew Muller sat down with Landsbergis at the Lithuanian embassy in London to talk about his plans for the future, his hopes for geopolitics in 2025, and the rise of populism, both in Lithuania and further afield.
We have to keep an eye on technology. Especially the one that is controlled not by, let's say, democratic actors, and specifically, one social network, TikTok, where algorithms are at least overlooked by what can be called, an extension of Chinese Communist Party. So it really drives the question forward. Like, okay, so are we conscious enough about what is happening there? Because in our case, as well, TikTok played a major part in the way that his messages were distributed around the country. He got enormous popularity, and exactly as you said, it came out of nowhere.
And we saw, of course, a similar dynamic in Romania.
And I think that Romanians use the momentum in order to inform the wider audience that this is becoming a problem. And I think that we have to address this. We have to find a way how to address this. I'm not a specialist, so I wouldn't be able to advise on, how do you address. algorithms, or is there a legislation that can be used, or I really don't know, but we cannot let it out of sight. I'm entirely convinced that it's not a coincidence that we're seeing this happening. So the second thing is that certain items on the fringe agenda, in some cases they slip out from more of a center party's agendas, kind of because it's maybe not entirely nice to talk about these things, But
what kind of things?
Well, for example, migration. The debate about migration is usually associated with the far right. So we leave the topic, entirely to populists, while the center does not have a remedy. So we leave it as it is, and it is a problem, and quite a lot of center-minded people in Europe see this as a problem. They don't use TikTok. They are not there. They don't seek out populists, just to keep voting for them, but they want this problem to be addressed. And if center does not, somebody else will. So in some cases, I would think that these problems need to be addressed by center parties in some meaningful way, maybe not offering something that is immediately operational, but really address this as an issue, because it is an issue for very, very many people.
We are looking ahead to the new year, and obviously it's going to be a period of considerable change for you personally. What are you going to do next?
Well, that's a very good question. At this stage, I started editing my diary that I have kept for 3 years after the war broke out.
3 quite eventful years for you.
3 quite eventful years, indeed. So I've started editing it. That's a lot of text. Now I think I've run something like 1,000 pages of raw words and sentences and impressions and whatnot. So I'm trying to figure out the way how to make it readable. I think it's a big part of it is quite interesting. So that will occupy some time. And then I intend to keep on advocating. I think that speaking out is important, especially since the world is not getting any calmer.
Indeed.
And advocating certain things that I believed in and I still believe in. I think it will remain important. So I will be tweeting or Xing. I don't know how it is called these days. Basically being active out there and speaking out.
Are you done with Lithuanian politics, though, do you think? At
this stage, yes. I announced that I'm taking a break. So even though I was elected to the parliament, I decided to leave it for this period. And a bit of distance might be healthy for me personally, and for my family definitely, but also for Lithuanian politics and for my party as well, a little bit, so that. There is a new dynamic. I'm sure that it will be formed, and I think it will be a good thing.
I just want to ask finally, because there are, as we have been discussing, any number of things we will have to worry about over the next 12 months. But if you've got yourself one hope, one sort of sliver of optimism that you're clinging to, what would you like to see be noticeably better this time next year?
Well, there is a chance that Ukraine will be in stronger position. There is a chance that Europe would find its strength. And I'm not saying just because I hope so, but there is an actual way towards it. There are elections in some important capitals and in Europe where we might see different attitude, I would say, forming. That would provide a push for Europe to get more cohesive, to get its strength together. This is where I would be looking forward, to some optimism. It might be shattered, obviously, but hopefully not, because there are so many people who do understand that this is needed. It's so unfortunate when we're seeing, and I'm seeing as a EU person, a continent of 27 countries that have a union of 450 million people and unable to show the strength for it, and where it clearly has an ability. So this is where my hope lies.
That was Gabrielius Landsbergis, former Foreign Minister of Lithuania, speaking to Andrew Muller of the Lithuanian Embassy in London. And for the full interview, tune into the Foreign Desk on Saturday at midday London time. And that's all we have for today's programme. Thanks to our producers Chris Chamak, Tom Webb and Desiree Bandley, and our studio manager Lily Austin. After the headlines, I'll be playing you more music and a selection of our sharp programming. We'll bring you The Briefing live at midday in London, and The Globalist will return at the same time tomorrow. I'm Georgina Godwin. Thank you for listening.